My name is Tom Cummins. That means I'm not Homi Bhabha. But it's still a pleasure to be here in front of you to begin this. I think this is the first of the master classes. Homi returned from London a bit under the weather, and so I have really received the great honor to do the introduction today. And as many of you know, but I should say that the master classes are the Mahendra Center's attempt to showcase scholars engaged in one of the humanities, whether it's essential practices interpreting with scrupulous care and patience, either a single text or an image or a practice. And over the years, we've looked here at poems by Yeats, paintings by Caravaggio, and a shot from Bonnie and Clyde. This year, there will be 3 master classes that will focus on one of the most traumatic years of the last century. That is 1968. It's hard to believe that was 50 years ago. And I will tell you how old I am by saying that that was the year that I graduated from high school. And those of you who were not of age then will not remember, should I say, that was such a traumatic year, the year of rage in Chicago, this death of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King. Most of you know this. But to have lived it was as traumatic a year as I think I've ever lived until this century. I never thought it would be that bad. And so, in addition to our tonight's speaker, Diana Sorensen, who will be speaking on Che Guevara's Pasajes, which was published in English in 1968. On Thursday, November 27th, Peter Gordon will discuss Adorno's Resignation. And then on Thursday, April 11th, Homi Bhabha will take on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, another really fundamental text that, again, is something that has meant a lot to me and to many of us working in the humanities and working across cultures and working with the colonial shackles that still seem to have us entwined in the 21st century. Tonight's speaker, Diana Sorensen, is La Decana Divina, retired, not from academics, but from administration. I had the wonderful privilege, well, that wasn't a privilege being chair, but I had the wonderful privilege of working as a chair with a most spectacular dean. She is, of course, more than a dean. She's the James Rothenberg Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and of Comparative Literature. And so, as she was a dean, she maintained a high profile as a scholar. Before joining the faculty in 2001 here at Harvard, she came from Columbia. Before that, she taught at Wesleyan University. She is a specialist in 19th and 20th century literatures of Latin America. Her books include The Reader and the Text, Interpretive Strategies for Latin American Literatures, Facundo and the Construction of Argentinian Culture, which won the MLA Prize for the best book in the field of Latin American scholarship. She also wrote on Sarmiento, someone who crosses between Argentina and Boston, an annotated edition of his works, and then A Turbulent Decade, Remembered Cultural Scenes from Latin America in the 60s. Her current work deals with mobility and shifting units of regional coherence, or incoherence, and it focuses on the transformations of the global in the 21st century. Her book, Territories, Trajectories, Cultures, and Circulation, is a wonderful book, one that I'm in the process actually right now of reading. It's published by Duke University Press. And as I said, she served and really did more than serve. She led as Dean of Arts and Sciences for 10 years before stepping down in 2016. And tonight's talk will be about Che Guevara, his writing, and the year 1968. Please help me welcome this wonderful Decana Divina.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for coming. This is an incredibly busy time of the year, so I'm happy to see you here. I also want to thank Homi's wonderful group at the Humanities Center, including Steve Beale, Mary Halbany Killip, Andrea Volpe, and Sarah Razor for helping get us going. So, the 50 years that separate us from 68 invite us to remember, commemorate, assess, and reinterpret. Hannah Arendt anticipated this urge to remember by claiming that, I quote, "the next century will once learn about 1968 the way we learned about 1848. And here we are. 68 does indeed occupy a central place in the revolutionary archive, filled with the inevitable contradictions of a youth culture that sought to reach out to the working class while it tried to integrate culture, eros, and politics. Today, when we are bereft of collective projects and utopian spirit, 68 appears like the nostalgic, dusty residue of a once dazzling set of fireworks. As Tom indicated, my class will deal with an iconic figure of 68, Che Guevara. The best rendition is in the wonderful poster that Steve and his people just did. And there we go. So I will look at the book that appeared in 63, Pasajes de la Guerra Revolucionaria, and, as was indicated, translated into English in 1968 as Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War. Let me begin with the historical stage upon which Che's fame arose, the Cuban Revolution of 1956 to 59. During its early years, before the repressive turn of the early 70s, the revolution ushered in new configurations of radical practice and ideologies of transformation, which occupied much of the social imaginary of the 60s, especially in Latin America. Their boundless belief in possibilities, in the creative verve to fashion humanity and its culture, cannot be separated from the experience of newness and invention which characterizes the writing of the 60s in the boom. The group of revolutionaries who set sail on the Granma in November 1956 fashioned themselves as an exemplary community held together by strong horizontal bonds, led and united by a powerful leader, Fidel Castro. With few exceptions, this community was structured as a phallocratic brotherhood based on a spirit of egalitarian and fraternal solidarity. In the shaping of the new community, Che played an emblematic role. one could make the perhaps startling case with Alma Guillermo Prieto that Che was, as she put it, the century's first Latin American, with that peculiar mixture of foreignness, transnational identity, and marked Argentinian idiosyncrasies, hence the Che, that made him both uniquely local and continental. The myth which grew upon his death turned him into a model for experience based upon the compelling mixture of striking individualism and unconventional personal style on the one hand, with the will to collective integration on the other. What Che Guevara exemplified was metonymical of the manner in which the Cuban Revolution wished to represent itself, thereby offering a possible resolution to the 60s growing disenchantment with what Marcuse would call unidimensional man. This also accounts for the immediate international appropriation of Che as myth after his death and his symbolic value in the Paris of May 68, articulated in the following observation made by Jean-Michel Palmier in the May 1968 issue of the magazine littéraire. Palmier says, "Dead, everyone wanted to appropriate his reflection, to approach his shadow, to forever imprint in their memory the features of this corpse with his wide open eyes, riddled with bullets." This spectral quality of the disembodied Che seemed to expand his presence and secrete a magical force which combined holiness with violence, austerity with celebration, effort with joy, fragility with power, unsullied heroism with defeat. Not until 97 were his remains found, so that the resulting spectrality had the haunting effect of the disappeared, occupying a space infused with longing for a body which had been withheld but might be found. As has been the case with other heroic figures, the absent body encouraged the myth of the eternal return. Here you see the cover of an Argentine weekly, Primera Plana, that fashioned itself after Time, and in 1967, in October, this is its cover, Guevara, dead or a phantom? Let me briefly comment on the exceptional effect of two photographs which contributed to this spectral quality and myth-making energy. The haunting Christ-like quality of the Freddy Alborta photograph taken right after his death in Valle Grande, Bolivia, has paradoxically engendered a disjunction between his captor's desire to proclaim and verify his death, and I want to show you what he looked like when he was first captured. So they wanted to leave no doubt as to the fact that this was indeed Che Guevara having been captured. So on the one hand, proclaiming and verifying his death, and at the same time, an unwitting creation of an everlasting icon, both heroic and martyr-like. Jean-Michel Palmier's observation that I read a moment ago deals precisely with the effect of this will to memory, which had so deep an impact on the imaginaire of 1968. Equally powerful, but with different inflections, was a 1960 photograph by Alberto Díaz Gutiérrez, known as Corda, taken at a ceremony to mourn 81 people killed at an explosion in Havana Harbor, a tragedy that Fidel Castro attributed, of course, to the CIA. Che's face here may have expressed a mixture of anger and sadness at the event. It was captured by Corda's lens, even though on that occasion there were distinguished foreign visitors, among them Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, whom he, Corda, was intent on photographing. At the time, the photograph was not chosen by the government magazine Revolución, which covered this particular rally, but 7 years later, in May or June 1967, Corda gave a print to the Italian publisher Feltrinelli, who turned it into a poster after the news of Che's death was divulged. Of course, the photograph was to have an illustrious life in its extraordinary circulation, as can be seen in a documentary film about it made in '82. In Cuba, Corda's photograph was enlarged to cover the entire facade of the Interior Ministry, which faces the Plaza de la Revolución, where a mass rally was held when Che's death was publicly announced on October 18, 1967. Later, it was appropriated by the Young Marchers of 1968 in Milan, Paris, London, Mexico City, and other places. The process of posterization was suited to street rallies. The form contributed to their spirit of freedom, and it had the boldness of design to express the widespread sense of discontent of the spirit of '68. The gravitational pull of the Che myth produced a space for the representation of fullness. It allowed the reordering of elements which existed in dislocated form in the social imaginary, producing what Alain Badiou would call a suturing effect that helped overcome paradoxes and disjunctions. The force of integration derived not only from the magic of his face, but also from what was known about his character, his behavior, and the considerable body of writing he left behind. Che's face had the spontaneity and versatility of expression, associated less with political figures than with actors. Asthma intensified the awareness of his body, marking it with fragility and willpower at the same time. His devastating asthma attacks, in fact, play an ever-present role in the representation of a Che who had to overcome their crippling effects by dint of will. Self-sacrifice and determination were key to the production of self, exemplified by Che, as central elements in the new man to be created after the revolution. Che epitomized this new man as the model the decade aspired to in its revolutionary inflection, as the subject whose self-definition rested on the politics of wrecking and building, hard at work on changing the world. In the construction of the Che myth, his style, his behavior, and his writings were all deployed toward an important aim of the early years of the Cuban Revolution: finding ways for the transition from individual passions, such as love, to the collective and social dimensions of the state. A new vision of community and the bonds that link it, negotiated by Che's model, one that supersedes the earlier paradigm which rested on the bourgeois family, was strengthened by this myth. Better suited to the mood of liberation of the 60s was his fervent espousal of a citizenry united by horizontal ties of equality and solidarity. This imagined community is organized around a different kind of desire, no longer galvanized by the reproductive aims of the family and its private values. It espouses the grammar of fraternity, apparently disavowing patriarchy, whilst fostering the conditions for utopian growth. And yet, as we shall see, in its center is located the revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, who performs exacerbated masculine values in his relationship with the body politic. So how does Che, the construct derived from the myth and the writer, fashion the project for the new man? Speeches given at commemorative festivities, at factories, high schools and universities, peasant gatherings and inaugural ceremonies construct a force field which attain an alchemical fusion of personal and collective, secular and religious. Che maps the terms for the definition of the new man in language appropriated from religion, his eyes set on the ideal revolutionary as he works out a new social pact. Here we come to the aporia which the efforts of critical theory, as developed by the Frankfurt School, never quite resolved, but whose way out was glimpsed by Benjamin in his less secular moments. The possibility of happiness as indissolubly bound up with images of redemption, claiming freedom, and reconciliation as utopian yet possible if our earthly existence is transformed into a superior form. Che seemed to suggest that these aspirations might be realized, and his death arrested the dream whilst creating the conditions of possibility for its perpetuation. Herbert Marcuse's one-dimensional man was to point in the same direction. He says, society will be rational and free to the extent to which it is organized, sustained, and reproduced by an essentially new historical subject. That goal would seem to lie beyond the limits of the state, to prefigure a new form of celebratory masculine sociability in which voluntary work took on a festive air. To show how these powerful forces find their way into writing, I've chosen this text written originally in serialized form and published in Verde Olivo, and later as Pasajes de la Guerra Revolucionaria in 1963, translated in 1968 as Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War. I will refer to it briefly as Pasajes. In reconstructing the Pasajes of the revolutionary campaign, which culminated in the overthrow of Batista, Che is working out an interesting narrative project, how to construct the future in the telling of the past. The temporal complexity is in part the work of memory, but it is furthered by the scene of reading which is invoked by the pasajes. The reader in question is experiencing the new revolutionary society. He is being embodied and modeled by the text in his hand as he traces the origin of the nation to be reconstructed. And here, let me announce that I'm not going to say he or she, because this is a deeply masculine and patriarchal vision. And it's really a masculine society that Che is referring to, even in his most revolutionary spirit. So Che's ostensible purpose, as set down in the preface, is to help preserve the memory of the revolution, protecting it from the ravages of oblivion, and addressing a question posed by the revolutionary leaders themselves, namely, how to write a history of the revolution. The effort of retrieval is central to Che's writing, which we could describe as an ethos of remembering, marked by the conceptual attempt to be self-critical and accurate. This is a part of the preface. The years pass, and the memory of the insurrection is dissolving in the past. We have not yet definitively set down these events, which already belong to the history of America. For this reason, I'm starting a series of personal reminiscences of attacks, battles, and skirmishes in which we all participated. It is not my intention that this fragmentary history, based on remembrances and a few hasty notes, should be taken as a full account. On the contrary, I hope that each theme will be developed by those who lived it. This is presented as the beginning of a collective work to be executed by a community of memory workers. In the very writing, the project had a collective dimension. Che would begin by recording the first draft. Then, when the typed version was produced by his secretary, he would not only rework it using his diaries to achieve greater accuracy, but he would also review the text in meetings held at the Ministry of Industry with his old comrades in arms, who shared their own reminiscences to correct and discuss Che's. Che claims to be taking only the first steps, issuing an invitation essential to the success of this project. There are many survivors of this battle, and each of them is encouraged to contribute his recollections so that the story may thus be filled out. The ethos of remembering is not fulfilled until the task of recalling and writing are submitted to scrupulous self-criticism. The author is to remove any word which may not be entirely true or of which he may not be entirely sure. Precisely because Che's ideal reader is learning as he follows his tale, Pasajes is structured along the topoi of errors, becoming and beginnings. Since the victorious outcome is the very presupposition of the book, he eschews the predictably epic tone and triumphalist rhetoric, replacing them with the rhythms of learning and transformation, better suited to narrative form, to the persona cultivated by Che, and to the mood of his youthful admirers who were drawn to his informality and lack of pretense. The opening pasaje, entitled Alegría del Pío, it's just a place in the Sierra Maestra area, is a case in point. It is built as an exemplary story in which the inventory of missteps is meticulously described, the better to avoid them in the future. Like school children who have yet to draw the unforgiving distinction between game playing and war games, the 82 youthful rebels who disembarked on December 1956 were soon to learn the dire consequences of inexperienced campaigning. Wearing ill-fitting boots, having lost their way at sea and on land, leaving traces which allowed the enemy to detect their whereabouts, lacking the judgment needed to tell friend from foe, they fell prey to an air raid that left many wounded, Che himself among them, and inflicted their first defeat. This pedagogy of mistakes is but the reverse of the process of learning and transformation, which leads to becoming a revolutionary army in this particular version of the Bildungsroman. Che's narrative is punctuated by moments of evaluation which keep marking beginnings. This master plot is reenacted at every occasion when the rebels seem to be on the verge of becoming an army. He ends his memoir with an account of effective, though minor, accomplishments. He calls them small feats, which began to drive Batista's troops away from the Sierra Maestra, as if what constituted a desirable coda were the vision of a promising beginning in which the rebels have become a fully fledged army, and the process of learning that particular lesson has come to fruition. Thus, the significance of Pasajes lies in the narration of learning from mistakes, which is at the center of Che's construction of the new man. If this lesson is learned, the task of vigilant self-fashioning can begin again and again, much in the same way as each arrival of reinforcements enacts the pattern of transforming the newcomers into true revolutionaries. A reading attuned to literary echoes, one that I cannot resist, detects in Che's writing two quite different forms which work together to address questions of ethics. One of them, the Picaresque, is inscribed in the rebellious register. It flouts normativity and opts for an irreverent contestation of the doxa. Conversely, the earlier one, the medieval exemplum, invokes normativity in a didactic manner, making the story subservient to the lesson. This particular mix is perhaps the writerly version of Che's style, carefree and moralizing at one and the same time. It makes the text hover on an interestingly unstable edge which mitigates the heavy imprint of teaching. In the emplotment provided by the economy of mistakes and learning, there are picaresque echoes infused with humor and a penchant for the ridiculous. Like the main character of picaresque novels, the young rebels sometimes resort to tricks when their own military callousness makes their wits more reliable than their soldiering. This lightens the narrative tone, and in the pleasure provided by humor, the reader can catch a glimpse of the youthful spirit of camaraderie, which blurred the boundary between living and dying, danger and fun, between soldiering and playing. Early on, for example, a brilliant ruse played by Fidel Castro on Chicho Osorio, an infamous foreman who terrorized the peasants on behalf of the local landowners, yields valuable information about the whereabouts of the army headquarters and the possible allegiances of the rural population. Che tells the story with obvious delight, not only at Fidel's daring and inventiveness, but also at the process of astutely giving the unwitting Osorio his just deserts. Tricking and tripping up the enemy are presented tongue-in-cheek, and the narrated encounter is not always lethal, as is the case with a captured soldier who never suspects that he's being fed the very horse he is intending to look after. Picaresque echoes are also present in the economy of scarcity that the rebels are subjected to. Lack of food and proper weapons is the focus of narrative concern. Che sometimes depicts himself as a latter-day Lazarillo de Tormes, lovingly evoking the ingestion of 4 sausages as one of the greatest banquets of his life, or acknowledging that the most lamented aspect of a defector's departure was his absconding with a can of condensed milk and 3 sausages. For Che's Cuban readers in 1963, this regime of shortages, of making do and doing without, may have helped negotiate experiences they were confirming in their daily lives. More powerful than the picaresque is, in the Pasajes, the vestige of an earlier narrative form which has been essential to the transmission of learning, the exemplum. Interspersed in the Reminiscences are numerous tales whose exemplarity lies in their presentation of a gallery of heroes and traitors through their actions, complete with codas which explicate and develop the didactic value of the passage in question. The result is a veritable study of human potential, ranging from the model provided by heroes, such as Frank Pais, to traitors, such as Eutimio Guerra, Felipe Pasos, and Raúl Chivas. But Che's task is not simply hagiographic or demonizing. He's also sketching the embrace of a future community, for which it is important to offer a spectrum of acceptable forms of behavior and degrees of political commitment. In Pasajes, one can detect a productive tension between the self constructed by the narrative voice and the one observed and admired in the heroic figure of Fidel. The I who tells the stories is self-effacing and modest to a fault, reluctantly assuming the protagonist's role and careful not to indulge in emotional self-expression unless he's recording the frailty of his asthmatic body. And while Che goes out of his way to name the women who have made heroic commitments to the revolution, this foundational community is essentially phallocratic. So the horizontal bonds of this collective singular, as Reinhard Koselleck calls this kind of community, can figure the state only if the dynamics of egalitarian solidarity is organized around a higher authority. This, of course, is Fidel Castro, the leader whose representation occupies the space carved out by Che. Wherever he has noted a lack derived from physical frailty or military ineptitude, poor strategic thinking, or faulty judgment, Che has filled it with a totalizing presence, the leader Fidel. Furthering the heroic representation of Fidel is a framing based on distance, which connotes infallibility. If Che can be construed as a possible model for an emerging kind of masculinity, inviting identification through the acknowledgement of weakness and the compensatory effort that accompanies it, Fidel can be seen instead as the emblem of a certain hypermasculinity performed as infallible leadership. So, as I draw to my conclusion, I want to close with a small anecdote that encapsulates the dynamics that I've just described between Che and Fidel. Che's deliberate undermining of his own authority for the sake of underscoring Fidel's is amusingly encapsulated in an anecdote conveyed with obvious delight by the novelist Guillermo Cabrera Infante. And I quote, "The late Comandante Duque used to tell a story of a shooting match in Sierra Maestra that he witnessed. Castro and Guevara were engaged in a war against boredom, doing practice against some empty beer bottles. Castro was hitting all the bottles, but Guevara hit none. Later, Duque asked Guevara, who was a sharpshooter, famous all over the Sierra, "Why, Che, you could do better than that." Guevara answered with a sneer and a true confession, "You want me to make our leader lose face? You should know better than that." How telling that this master of self-effacement and revolutionary commitment would be appropriated by the branding and marketing machine that had turned him into an advertising tool for Smirnoff vodka, for Mercedes-Benz, for Converse sneakers. Che's ideals may belong to the past in our era bereft of collective projects, but the work of nostalgia and marketing marches on. Thank you.
That was a wonderful exposition of both the commercialization of Che and Che's own text and the contradictions that lie within that, which are sometimes very hard to resolve. And just before opening it up to questions, I just had a few comments because I sat down and reread the text. I must have read it about 1969 or 70. And one of the things that really struck me, which you mentioned here, are two things that Che does talk about, in which all of a sudden he moves out of the deprecating individual to one that is, as you read it, a somewhat heroic individual. And that is when he is shot and thinks he's going to die. And it's the only time, I think, in the book, I may be wrong, that he actually appeals to literature. And he appeals to Jack London and his short story, To Build a Fire. And of those of you who have ever read that, it's the coldest story ever written, because this individual is in, of all places, the antithetical place where he is, where he's talking about mosquitoes, the heat, the bother. And To Build a Fire, of course, takes place in Alaska. And it's about an individual who is freezing to death and tries to build a fire. And in the end, he gets the fire going, and the fire is under a tree, and the branch, as I remember, drops the snow on the fire, and it puts it out. And then he has to sit back and heroically accept his own death, stoically. And Che says this, I was like this figure. He doesn't mention the story, but I know the story. I mean, he mentions the author, and it's that moment of self-realization of both death and accepting death in this, really stoic way that couches him in a very different light. And the other instance is one that, as you're reading it, you realize that he is writing this down to someone who he talks about teaching to read and write, the peasant. Yes. And all of a sudden there's an engagement with a reader for whom he has performed the heroic task of learning to read and write. So every once in a while for me, Che comes through and he comes through one other time this way, and it's when they're in full retreat and he has to make a decision because he's a doctor or he's a guerrillero. And he says, I can't carry both medicine and ammunition, and I have to decide. And what does he decide? He picks up the ammunition. So he leaves his medicine behind. So that there are these moments to me in the text where Che professes himself in different ways that are not about Fidel, but really are about him and his becoming, either by dying or choosing to be I am a guerrillero, those kinds of things. So that there's a multiplicity, I think, sometimes when you read this, between Che as the individual there, who also gets blisters and has to carry his shoes, as you said, but also these moments that mark him as teacher, as reader, and as revolutionary, as opposed to being a doctor.
That's a wonderful observation, Tom. And I would add one more instance, which is when Fidel decides to make him comandante.
Yeah.
And he's named comandante in a very casual way, but for Che Guevara, this is another moment of becoming. Yeah. So they're not many, but they are significant moments.
And they punctuate the text. I mean, they don't come one after another. They're just all as you're reading along, as you described it. But every once in a while, it opens that up. And it is, as you say, a very hyper male text. So the three women who he names are named not as individuals, but as compañeras.
Yes.
And nobody else is called compañero that way to anybody. I would rather, open it up now for those who might have questions or comments about the text, or comments on the talk.
Peter.
Thank you very much. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, it's on.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. The particularly interesting to me is the literary question, namely the question of the Picaro or the Picaresque and the degree of its reconcilability with moments of learning. And it seemed to me that you were arguing that there's a simultaneity of the Picaresque and, well, I wouldn't say the Bildungsroman, but of learning, whereas it seems to me that the learning that happens in the course of a picaresque is always only pretense or only ever temporary, and by the fifth or sixth misadventure, at the latest, you no longer think of any of the learning from mistakes that's going on as being in any way authentic. And so I'm wondering if you could trouble that a bit more.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Peter. I would say that these are strands that appear in the text. And the picaresque lightens the tone. In the tradition started in the 16th century by Lazarillo de Tormes, the Lazarillo does learn quite a lot, but it's all very disenchanting. You know, it's about Spanish society in the 16th century overwhelmed by appearances and lacking any kind of agency. But I think that Che is finding ways to draw on the repertoire to lighten up and make the didactic tone more digestible.
The picaro is a function of the learning by mistake rather than the other way around.
Yes, and I would be doing the text an injustice if I considered it an example of the picaresque, because there's a lot at stake here. But there is a lot of that sort of light-hearted tripping up or tricking because the characters themselves are learning and they're trying to make their way through by dint of wit more than soldiering at first.
Thank you.
Yes.
Could
you tell us who you are?
This is being recorded, yes. And we need this for the mic. Can you take mic? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Ogden Ross. Is there a way in which Che's political Marxist theory, which in my mind was somewhat more radical in nature than Castro, perhaps, be contrasted in the stories to Castro, particularly in response to the overthrow of Batista, which was the whole point of this anyway, and that is that part of the narrative?
Part of the
narrative.
Not in this case,
no.
Because this is the story of the exploits that took place between 56 and 59. So it's about, trying to convince the rural population. And of course, you referred to Che's doctrine. He articulated the Foucault theory, which was based on rural uprisings, not urban uprisings. But this text, the Reminiscences, is more about remembering than about expounding a political program. That will come later. And you are right that as the Cuban Revolution is consolidated, Fidel will tend towards the Soviet model, and Che, for a while, because it was a very short while, felt greater allegiances with the Chinese model. Yes.
So you talked about...
Could you just identify yourself?
I'm Kayla.
Okay.
I'm a student here. You talked about disembodied images, and it seemed to me that it was very profoundly ambivalent, the ways that images get disembodied, because the image that was meant to capture Castro's death and show everyone...
Che's death.
Oh, sorry. Che's death.
Castro dies much later.
To show the U.S.'s ultimate victory over Che Guevara did anything but, and got circulated as a revolutionary trope that empowered a lot of movements. But then at the end you said that now that image has been appropriated by capitalism in like commercializing everything, ironically, everything he stood for. So how does that shift happen? And do you think it's possible to shift it again and read Che Guevara's consistent haunting presence in capitalism as kind of the potential for that revolutionary sentiment to reappear?
Thank you, Kayla. I'll start with your last question, and I don't mean to be flippant, but the answer is up to you and your generation. Are you ready to, espouse idealism and a sense of the collective that's based on solidarity and not on competition and a rearrangement of certain values? The other part of your question would take, perhaps deserves a long answer, but let me say that the 70s, right after the death of Che Guevara, the 70s are a period of retrenchment. All the revolutionary fervor of '68 ends up becoming clandestine movements in mostly urban environments. And there are military takeovers to avoid what is seen as a terrible risk to democracy. And then we have the further decline of moments like the dirty war in Argentina or the various dictatorships. And again, leaping through the decades, 50 have gone by, I would say that the neoliberal order has done a lot to dissolve ideologies of change for the sake of a vision of prosperity, the free market, and has silenced some of the ideological programs that were so confidently proclaimed in the 60s. So I'm not giving you the answer you deserve, but it sort of points to the general direction.
We have a question here. Yes, just wait for the mic. If you could just identify yourself.
Okay. Hello, thank you. My name is Rosa Montes. I'm a visiting scholar from Mexico, but originally from Argentina. And I really enjoyed your talk and the going back to these writings. I would like to just make a comment, a sort of anecdotal evidence from a recent visit a few years ago to Cuba in 2016, early 2016. And being from Argentina, I talked to a couple of people on the street who remembered those times and had reminiscences of Che. And I remember very clearly a conversation while we were on a long wait with a bus driver who seemed to have known a lot of people around that time, very critical of the current government and very critical of the people that had, according to this bus driver, sort of lost their way. And his opinion, he had some kind of official function, but his opinion was that Che and Fidel were really crossing paths and were going to come to a big confrontation, and Che had to leave, and how he rejected some of the privileges that the ruling class at that time, the government at that time, were enjoying. And the anecdote was how during the blockade and during the crisis, Fidel had sent some food to his home, and Doña Leida very happily was cooking the chickens and the rest of the provisions that had been sent. And when Che got back, he had them sent back to Fidel, thanking him, but rejecting him because he couldn't accept something that the rest of the people were not enjoying.
Thank
This
you.
may be true or not, but it's part of how the myth lives on
Yes.
right
and
now.
A lot has been said about the tensions between Fidel and Che in '65. And Che went off to Congo and then eventually to Bolivia. And there is a sense that it may have been because there was no longer a role for him to play in Cuba. Thank you. Mariano.
Thank you, Diana, for this wonderful talk.
Mariano, can you just identify yourself for the
Oh,
recording?
sorry, yes. My name is Mariano Siskin. I'm the partner of Romance Languages and Literatures and Comparative Literature. And thank you for the wonderful talk. And I think you touched upon a bit about what I wanted to ask you. So maybe if I reformulate what I was going to ask you, I have... it's not about Che, but about how the wonderful ending of your paper about the... well, I don't know. But that's what I want to ask you. But it's about the image and the appropriations of the image, and working in two different ways. One thing that I had never thought, but it was a striking resemblance and reminiscence of when you projected the photograph of his death body surrounded by the Bolivian military. Yes, please. I mean, that's because, and this is just a comment, but I think it's striking in the composition of this photograph, the way it seems to mimic Rembrandt's anatomy lesson. And so I wanted to ask you if there was any thought in terms of in Che's scholarship in relation to, because I mean this is a very as you explained very in detail, highly produced scene that had a very deliberate intentions in terms of the circulation of to attest to the death of Che. So that is one thing, and the other one has to do with the ending of your paper, which is the. Tom, can we see the Cordas picture? Is the in terms of the processes of commodification of his image that you finished with, the composition of Barack Obama's poster Hope, particularly the direction of the gaze and the position of the head, reappropriated, of course, devoided of any of the radical politics of Che, a form of radical politics that perhaps could have been consumed when the poster came up during the 2008 campaign, but as time went on, 8 years of his presidency perhaps dissolved, and perhaps going in the same direction of the processes of commodification that you pointed to. So those two not intertextualities, but interfigural relations of these images, and the fact that, I mean, you've written so much wonderful texts about Che, but making clear, I think as a gesture, but this is what I want to ask you, that he can be reread, he can be put in different kinds of networks, but there's he can be reinscribed as a writer, but not recuperated in terms of his radical politics. So, if that's, in spite of what you answered to Kayla, like I want you to say more, about the way that you see the possibilities and limitations of this revisiting of his figure today.
Thank you, Mariano. Let me start with the images. And indeed, shortly after Feltrinelli created the poster, John Berger, whom many of us have read, the art historian and theoretician, said, oh, this is just, well, not this one, but the one where he's lying dead. This
I'm good at
is
this.
just like the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, and this is just like Mantegna's painting of Christ. And I would add, just like Holbein's Christ in his sepulchre. So it was immediately captured. There is one thing about the way in which this image that seems to be so carefully arranged has a rather gruesome detail. Do you see a limb down there in front of one of the soldiers on the far left? So as much as this seems to be an arranged scene, it betrays some of the terrible things that were going on. Che was captured with 2 other guerrilleros. So that about the images that you absolutely identified correctly. About the revolutionary message and how we could arrest the marketing and the commercial appropriation of Che's myth that would make him die all over again if he saw it. Imagine Mercedes-Benz selling its car, putting on the little logo instead of the star up there, or ice creams. There's a Magnum ice cream called Che Guevara. And we could go on and on. I think the big question of our time and the big task of the work we do in the university is to rethink the whole question of a program for community, for solidarity, for reigniting some kind of utopian possibility. Right now, for all the reasons I don't need to even refer to, I'm very pessimistic, which is not in my nature, but it's difficult to get up every morning these days. And it's not just Trump's America, but a lot of what's happening in other parts of Latin America, such as Venezuela, where what would be a populist message has derailed in really terrible ways. So it's something I'd love to talk more about with you. So I'm just sort of gesturing towards an answer.
I'm going to interject just to say one thing about Mariano's question and the commercialization of this photograph. First of all, the photograph is taking on a trope that goes back to the 16th century, at least in terms of a kind of portrait type, which is when the viewer doesn't look at you and looks up like that, that's a regal photograph. I mean, that really is, this is a posed photograph. This is not a snapshot. And it is one that resonates completely within the history of art as a kind of retrato, portrait that is well known, so that as soon as you see it, you associate it with certain kinds of rhetorical meanings, whether you know it or not, because you've seen it over and over again. And just as you see in this photograph here, there's also the demonstration of proof, which is the counter to the doubting Thomas. When you put your finger in the chest like that, that becomes a Christ-like figure immediately. But here he's proving he's dead, but of course in doing that you're proving he's alive. And the other thing I couldn't help saying is that Adorno's analysis of the culture industry has been used to really talk about these images and what happens to political imagery and rap and all kinds of radical counterculture images, music, etc., as it's run through the culture industry, as Adorno describes very well. So this was well articulated in the 50s already in terms of what was going to be happening. But this photograph is paradigmatic of what Adorno is arguing about. There's a question right here.
I would just add that, interestingly, the portrait, not this one, but the other one, was snapped by Korda while he was watching the crowd at this memorial service.
Yeah, but it's cropped and taken down below.
It's just a perfect choice.
He's a professional photographer.
Yeah. And by the way, Tom, he keeps all the rights and the revenue. So,
well, thank you, Diana, for a wonderful talk.
Would you just identify?
Oh, sorry, my name is Adriana Gutierrez, and I teach at Romance Languages and Literatures. No, thank you for a very, very meaningful, thoughtful talk. And my question was more, I was puzzled by another or relationship with the picaresque is that self-effacement of the pícaro that is there to tell the tale of others, and by learning through watching and witnessing. And in that his self-effacement serves for the purpose of creating the image of Fidel as, the perfect leader. And he portrays himself as somehow the imperfect or the learner after Fidel in this very paradigmatic duo that is also very much of the picaresque. But that as thinking about what Mariano said later, that self-effacement is as if he were also preparing the ground for the social destiny of his own image. That is that self-effacement that has allowed people to put in the anecdotes, real or imagined, some of them, and to present an image, a very pristine image, precisely because of that self-effacement. That he somehow never, even though he's using himself as an exemplum, he really doesn't become that. It's Fidel who becomes that. So it's as if he's there to tell the tale, but at the same time, he's the one who follows the revolutionary dream that Fidel never really achieves. So in that sense, I disagree with Mariano in the sense that he's also an open mark for reinterpretation, and that political ideologies may come and go, but that he's still an open symbol to be refilled with possibilities, maybe not of technical guerrilla warfare, but with possibilities and images that will be created in the future.
Well, I will be keen to see how that gets reappropriated, and if one could say, wrested from co-optation. But it would be a very productive thing if the miracle could happen.
My name is Gustavo Quintero. I'm from the Roman Studies Department. Diana, thank you so much. It was a great talk. I have two questions. The first one is, we can see how there is a Christification of the Che in all these images, but I was wondering how or to what extent there is this presence of religious topics and religious tropes within el Pasajes de la Guerra Revolucionaria. Does he mobilize some of those to And the second question I have, and it's more like a comment, it's very interesting because if I understand correctly, these passages come from they were previously circulated in the Verde Olivo magazine, right?
Yes.
And so at the same time, they try to show how the future should be from the past. It seems to me that the future is already split because they publish it twice. So it's already this idea of circulation of how the future is, but it's already published once in the Verde Olivo and another time in the passages.
Well, I don't think I would run with that hypothesis because that would suggest that every time a book is reissued, there aren't new readers to be reached. And when it appeared in Verde Olivo, it was really at the very beginning. And so you could imagine that you have a readership that's sort of following Verde Olivo, which was truly a kind of military journal that got set up immediately after 59. And then in the process in which a book gets, if you will, I won't say canonized, but established as an important book for the revolutionary project, then it continues to create a sense of the future. Now, does it do that now? Did it do that 10, 20 years after it came out? No. At that point, it was read differently, and that's sort of the life of a text. Remind me, Gustavo, what was your other... you asked me if the Christ... I think what you see is a kind of secular project expressed in religious terms. And a lot of his speeches, not just in this book, but in many, many speeches, and he gave a lot, you have this sense of a future march towards a greater, higher level of humanity. And it's difficult to separate that from the vocabulary we have inherited in religious terms. But I would not say that Che in any way portrays himself as a Christ figure. These are kind of accidents of the evolution of the myth, the photographs, and the historical record. And that's why I mentioned the strangeness of the body disappearing for 30 years. Nobody knew where it was. They surgically removed his hands, and a few years after his death, they were sent to Fidel Castro. So the body was turned into a kind of spectral, ghostly absence.
One question there, and then we'll take the last one over here.
Okay. I forgot to introduce myself the first time. Sorry. Peter Berger, German department, and forgive me for asking a second question. But I found this anecdote about the shooting contest very striking, and I think it's topical given the question of self-effacement, because it strikes me that it is both a self-effacement and an act of power, an act of arrogance and presumption. For in losing to Fidel on purpose, of course, Che is becoming Fidel, right? Is showing fidelity to him, but at the same time, he's losing on purpose, which is an act of presumption and arrogance, and placing himself above Castro. I wonder what you think about that being a highly problematic example of self-effacement.
I'd be with you, Peter, if he were losing in a very explicit, clear way. But the assumption is that the man went up to him and said, "What are you doing?" Because it looked as though he wasn't managing to hit the beer bottle. So I think we can assume that he was not flaunting his...
I don't think flaunting, but he is, this very technical sense, in the sense of the name, becoming fidel, right, by doing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't call it, what did you say, defiant? I think it's a much more muted gesture.
Well, presumptuous, I'd say, but maybe it's not the right word for it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Anna Gathangelu, York University. I have a couple of questions. The one goes to your, when you were talking about the Picaresque around the ethics question. So you set it up as being about, the one is about doxa, and normativity basically. And then the second one, you were talking more about the pleasure provided by humor, and then, of course, the food economy as well. I'm wondering if there was I don't know, I haven't read the text very carefully, but I'm curious if there was a different way of reading it that points not to this kind of, in a lot of ways, so the one is the hyper-masculine and the other one is the masculine embodiment, but whether you can read it in a way that really challenges this kind of dichotomization of the subject itself through these ethics and these economies that you have articulated. So that's the first question. And
Can I answer it just so that we don't get lost?
That would be great.
No, I think that if you read the text, you will see that there is one elegantly self-effacing narrative voice that is obviously becoming a guerrillero, as Tom was saying. He was really a doctor. And the commitment to giving Fidel Castro the leadership role. So I would say that distinction holds through the whole.
No, I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't hold, but is there any way as readers, contemporary readers, that are interested in disrupting some of these kind of appropriations that are taking place, that we can do a reading that can also open kind of different orientations beyond this kind of, dominant, very masculine?
Well, I'd like there you'd have to do it and show me, and I'd tell you whether I could go along with it, because this is not an open text. Yeah. This is a text with a purpose. But I'd be very curious. I mean, it's always important to reread and discover other interpretations. And
my second question comes out, and probably is not in this text, but since you suggested it, around the Chinese and the Soviets. And I'm really curious, based on your other work, whether some of that comes through, a little bit later in terms of the tensions that are generated, and the reason I'm interested in that, since everybody's talking about the future, were there some kinds of imaginations that were really crucial, but were not taken, let's say through the project of Fidel, but they are still important for us to take more seriously. So,
thank you. I would say that there's an area in many of his later writings, that is before he leaves, in 1965, because after that he writes his Congo diary and his Bolivian diary. But there is something to think about when he is speculating about voluntary labor and how to create a community motivated by solidarity, by the willingness to work, by doing away with the distinction between labor and intellectual work. And so that's a project that he was extremely keen on and did not really succeed in, but there's quite a bit of writing, and it would be interesting to see that, because for him, the new society can only take place if the collective needs and the willingness to do voluntary work at every level is sustained. You're welcome. All right, Tom.
I think we'll bring it to a close. And
yes.
Please.